And we're back. Welcome to my Premier League predictions for Game Week 2. It is so good to have football back once again, and the Premier League delivered as it always does on Game Week 1. And we've got some bumper fixtures for you this week in Game Week 2. Before we get into it, a quick reminder, as always, if you haven't done so already, please do consider dropping a like on this video, sharing it with a friend, subscribe with notifications on if you're new around here. We have just dropped our La Liga predictions for Game Week 2. A link to that will be available at the top of your screen right now. But for the first time ever on this channel, we have posted all 5 major leagues this weekend. And of course, if you want access to the remaining 3 leagues, Bundesliga, Serie A, and League predictions, those are available for members only. And I want to say a massive welcome to Samuel Mutis, who was the first new member of the season. And as always, welcome back to those of you who did rejoin as members last week to gain access to those bonus predictions that we do host over on the community page. Without any further ado, though, here are the 10 games taking place in the Premier League this weekend. So let's just get straight into it. We start off with tonight's game between West Ham United and Chelsea. Both of these sides making incredibly disappointing starts to the season based on where they would have wanted to be at the end of Game Week 1. Obviously, Chelsea, that 0-0 draw with Crystal Palace, which debatably they could have lost if it wasn't for that interesting decision regarding that Everett as a free kick. A lot more on that player coming up over the course of this video. For West Ham, though, a 3-0 defeat to Sunderland on the opening day has already put a massive spotlight on Graham Potter and what potential he has going into this season as a West Ham manager. To make matters worse, there's been a lot of speculation over the last few days about certain key players of their squad wanting to leave. Off the back of that result, most notably, of course, Lucas Paqueta, who has now been cleared of all of his wrongdoings. So he's well within his rights to seek better club options available to him, given how talented he is. It is expected, though, that he will be available for this match. It is expected that West Ham have no fresh concerns coming into this match. Obviously, Alvarez has now left the club, one of the other players we've mentioned, but he wasn't really a big part of West Ham, in my opinion. For Chelsea, no fresh injury concerns. Tosin Adarabioyo could be back for this one, but given it's the Friday night game, it may be too soon for him. And I reckon there could be some changes. I think Estevao could potentially start this one after looking lively off the bench against Crystal Palace in a game where not many other Chelsea players looked like they were offering too much. Before we go into it, though, it should be noted that Chelsea have won the last 3 meetings between these two sides, including winning 3-0 at the London Stadium last season. So given the fact they just lost 3-0 to Sunderland, they're not going to want a repeat of that one. I do still think Chelsea are going to come out on top, though. I just don't think it's going to be as severe as that 3-0 from last season or last week. I'm going for a 1-0 victory to Chelsea. On to Saturday, and what a game we've got to kick off Saturday this week. It is Manchester City taking on Tottenham, and there is, of course, so much transfer talk regarding these two sides at the moment. Are Manchester City going to be bringing in the likes of Donnarumma and Rodrigo? Are Tottenham going to bring in any attacking midfielders now after the decision from Eberechi Eze to go to Arsenal? Are they going to bring in Savinho from Manchester City? They're obviously not going to do that before this game, but it's going to be an opportunity for the two parties to meet and discuss a potential deal, I am sure. Obviously, both of these sides got off to really good starts in the Premier League last week. You'll see Manchester City are top of the league following their 4-0 victory over Wolves. Spurs are in third after their 3-0 victory over Burnley. So both sides are going to be full of confidence coming into this one. In terms of the team news, I think, again, we'll see some change from Manchester City. I'd expect the likes of Mamouche and Cherki to probably come into the starting lineup. There are still fitness doubts over the likes of Gvardiol and Phil Foden, so I'd expect both of them to miss this one. But I think we'll see a slightly stronger team from Manchester City than the one we saw against Wolves last week. For Spurs, I would expect a change of shape for them. We saw them play 5 at the back against PSG. It's how Thomas Frank used to operate as Brentford manager in the big games against a tough opposition. He would tend to go to a 5 at the back structure. It worked well against PSG. I think is what he's going to deploy for this one here, with one of those midfielders potentially missing out. Be interesting to see who plays at left back, though. Udogie is apparently back and available for this match, but Jed Spence just signed a new deal. It's had a really good start to the season. I would probably expect him to continue at left back given the lack of prep time Udogie has had for this one. In terms of the head-to-head record, it's actually not that bad when you look from a Spurs perspective. People are seeming to forget that last season, Spurs won 4-0 at Manchester City. Granted, City then did win 1-0 at Spurs, but it can't be overlooked that Spurs did get that unbelievable result last season. 4-0 they won on this ground. Obviously, though, City have to be considered the favourites for it. I think it's going to be a really entertaining game. I'm expecting a lot of goals from both sides. But ultimately, I'm going to go for that Manchester City win. I was tempted to go for 2-1 because Spurs are going to play 5 at the back. But nah, I want more entertainment. I'm going for 3-2 to Manchester City. On to the 3 o'clocks, and we have two sides who both conceded 4 goals last week. Bournemouth going down 4-2 to the defending champions. Wolves losing 4-0 at home to Manchester City. Although, it has to be said, the performance of Bournemouth certainly a much better one than what we saw from Wolves last week, with, of course, Bournemouth going down to a couple of very late goals from Liverpool, despite missing key players such as Cook, Cliver and Christie. So I think Bournemouth can hold their heads high from what was a really good performance from them last week, despite the fact they did concede 4, and a lot of their new signings did put in some good performances. For Wolves, though, very worrying start to them. Obviously, they were at home to Manchester City and didn't really lay a glove on them, if we're being honest. I think this is going to be a real uphill task for them to bounce back from that against Bournemouth. That said, Wolves haven't lost at Bournemouth since 2015 and are unbeaten in their last 6 matches at this ground. Granted, they did lose on penalties in the FA Cup last season. But in terms of league form, they have a very, very good record at Bournemouth. So don't write them off just yet when it comes into this one. In terms of the team news, no fresh concerns for either side, but both teams have potential new players to call upon, with Ben Doak being available for Bournemouth and Chachua being available for Wolves. I'm going to butcher that name every single time until I actually learn how it's said. I can definitely see this one being a close one, but purely based off of the 2 performances from these 2 sides last week, I have to go for a Bournemouth victory here, ending that poor run of form at home to Wolves. I'm going for a 2-1 victory to Bournemouth. Whilst that game's going on, Brentford will be taking on Aston Villa. And speaking of new signings, Brentford will have a new signing from Bournemouth to call upon, with £40 million forward Dango Ouattara ready and available for this one. And boy, are they going to need him after what was a poor offensive display against Nottingham Forest last week. To be fair, of course, they did score that penalty, with Thiago finally getting his moment after signing last summer. For Aston Villa, they're going to be coming into this after what was, I think, also a pretty poor performance, certainly in that first half against Newcastle. But at least they performed better in the second half, certainly defensively with the 10 men after Ezri Konsa got sent off. But a 0-0 draw against a kind of all over the place Newcastle at the moment is a pretty poor start, I think, for Aston Villa. Obviously, Konsa is going to be unavailable for this game for Aston Villa following his red card last week. What is interesting is the goalkeeper situation, with Martinez now back and available after his suspension from game week 1. Will he come straight back into the team, or will Bezo keep his place after what was a pretty impressive performance against Newcastle last week? For Brentford, obviously still no Johan Visser, as he has completely cut all ties with Brentford from all of social media and the like. But like we said, they have got Ouattara available for this one. Coming into this, Villa, I think, have to be considered the favourites. They won here 1-0 last season. They're unbeaten in their last 7 matches, home and away, against the Bees. I'm backing that run of form to continue here, especially given how poor Brentford were last week. I'm going for a 2-0 victory to Aston Villa. The final 3 o'clock game is a battle between 2 sides who got promoted from the Championship last season. Second place Burnley taking on the playoff winners in Sunderland. But it's actually now Sunderland who occupy second place in the league table, and Burnley sit in 18th after game week 1. And I think a lot of people a couple of weeks ago would have probably had Burnley as the favourites for this match. But after last week, I think all of those people are going to be favouring Sunderland when it comes to this one. As we've already mentioned, a really impressive 3-0 victory for Sunderland on match day 1 over West Ham. Burnley, pretty unimpressive in their 3-0 away defeat to Spurs, although that is a tough place to go for the opening day of the season. Sunderland, though, they've backed it up by making even more signings. Their new one, of course, coming in, Nordi Mukiele. Burnley still haven't really done anything to impress me in the transfer market. Ojukuku and Broya could be in line to make their first starts after their moves from Chelsea. Obviously, no fresh concerns for Sunderland coming into this one. They are very unlikely to change their starting lineup from their impressive performance last week. Should be noted, though, 3 of the last 5 matches between these two sides in the Championship have ended in 0-0 draws. So we could definitely see it being a very low-scoring game here. But like I said, after last week, I'm struggling to look past a Sunderland victory here. Naturally, it will end up 0-0, because whenever I mention 0-0s and don't go for it, it always ends up being 0-0. But I'm going for a 1-0 victory to Sunderland. Could definitely see it going all 3 ways, but after last week, you can't look past a Sunderland victory here. The final game on Saturday sees the final promoted side, the Championship champions in Leeds United, taking on Arsenal in a Premier League classic from down the years. We've seen some massive games between Arsenal and Leeds, and I'm hoping that this one is going to go on the same lines. Arsenal, of course, getting that 1-0 victory at Old Trafford in what was a very poor performance on the opening day for them, but to be fair to them, they still got the result. For Leeds, they also got a 1-0 victory, but theirs was under highly controversial circumstances with that interesting handball decision from the linesman to penalise James Tarkowski, which VAR decided not to overturn. That, of course, was then converted by Nemecha to give Leeds their 1-0 victory, which means both of these sides come into this game in exactly the same position. Arsenal sitting 6th and Leeds sitting 7th on nothing but pure alphabetical order. That'll, of course, potentially be the case if it ends in a draw, but not if there is a result either way. Obviously, for Arsenal, the news we have to talk about is, of course, Eberechi Eze. He now didn't play for Crystal Palace last night, meaning that if he signs before midday today, he could very well be playing in this match against Leeds tomorrow night. Personally, I think it's a great signing for them. I think it's going to make a big difference for them. And obviously, the other team news for Arsenal is Kai Havertz, his knee injury, which is going to see him out for a couple of months. For Leeds, we could see a couple of changes to their lineup. Could Dominic Calvert-Lewin be given his first start? Could Nemecha be given his start after performing well off the bench and getting the late winner? We shall see. Ultimately, I would expect Arsenal to still come out on top here. Leeds haven't beaten Arsenal in over 15 years now. And on top of that, Arsenal have won the last 5 meetings between these two sides in the Premier League. It was a 4-1 victory at home for them 2 years ago. I'm going for a slightly smaller scoreline here, though. I'm going to go for 3-0. Granted, it's the same margin. I think Leeds could score, but with how well Arsenal defended last week, I don't really see Leeds getting anything off of them. 3-0, I'm going to Arsenal. On to Sunday then, and oh boy, it's a spicy one here. It is Crystal Palace taking on Nottingham Forest for the first time since UEFA decided to grant the Europa League place to Nottingham Forest, sending Palace down to Europa Conference League qualifying. In respect to Crystal Palace, though, they did, of course, get their victory last night in Conference League qualifying after getting a very impressive 0-0 draw away at Chelsea. This will, of course, be their first game without Eberechi Eze, as he now moves to Arsenal, as we've just mentioned. But I do think they're going to have a pretty decent chance coming into this one, and obviously they're going to be very, very fired up for it, because of all the controversy surrounding themselves and Forest and those battle for European places over the course of the last few weeks. Forest, to their credit, have absolutely done bits since that announcement has been made, though. They got the victory over Brentford last week in a really impressive 3-1 victory, and since then have brought in 3 new signings that all could play in this game. James McAtee, arguably one of the star players of the Under-21 Euros. Amari Hutchinson, another arguably star of the Under-21 Euros, both for England in their winning performances over the summer. And of course, former Premier League player Douglas Luiz, former Aston Villa man, who I think is a very, very quality player. They've basically got the England Under-21 midfield plus Douglas Luiz, when you consider they've already got Elliot Anderson as well. Really, really exciting times for Nottingham Forest, and they're going to be looking to capitalise even further on that result in getting into the Europa League by making even more high-class signings like they have over the last few days, and then punishing Crystal Palace further by beating them in this fixture. It's going to be an interesting one, although it should be noted that it is very, very close between these two sides. The last 3 consecutive matches here have been draws. The last 2 at Selhurst Park ended in a draw. And I do think that is still the most likely result here. If I was going to pick a favourite, after the week they've had, I would probably go for Nottingham Forest. But with that extra bit of animosity, I still think Crystal Palace can't be written off in this one. Both teams, very, very good. On their day, could both get the victory. I'm very torn between 0-0 and 1-1. But given the fact that I think this game is going to have a little bit of extra spice to it, I will expect there to be goals. And I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw between Crystal Palace and Nottingham Forest. Whilst that game's going on, we will be seeing the first official game at the Hill Dickinson Stadium as Everton open their doors for the first time in a competitive capacity to take on Brighton and Hove Albion. Both of these sides on the receiving end of late heartache last week. Everton, as we already mentioned, of course, that controversial penalty converted by Leeds, meaning they lost their opening game 1-0. For Brighton, a 96th minute equaliser from Rodrigo Muniz, meaning that Fulham stole the 2 points away from them. But I wouldn't say it was unjust. Obviously, we'll touch on Fulham shortly. But Brighton didn't quite do enough in the 96 minutes to get the victory, and it did end up in a 1-1 draw. So where do we see this game going? Again, I think it's going to be a pretty close one. It should also be noted that Everton have already played a game at their new stadium. They lost 1-0 against Roma in the pre-season friendly that they played here. So they are actually yet to score at their new stadium and yet to score in the Premier League this season. They're also potentially struggling when it comes to a couple of injury concerns, with Mikalenko still out, with Branthwaite still out, James Garner likely to play at left back once again. I think most people, though, are expecting Jack Grealish to make his full debut for Everton in this one. Could he be the difference maker for them? For Brighton, no fresh injury concerns and potentially a return for Hinshelwood in midfield. Matt O'Reilly, of course, getting the goal last week from the penalty spot. Could he be on his way out of Brighton, though, over the next few days? It remains to be seen. Over the last few years, it has been very, very close between these two sides. And it's actually the away sides that won both results last year. Everton winning 1-0 at Brighton, but Brighton winning 3-0 in their final visit to Goodison Park. That was the kind of the anomaly result, though. It's normally pretty close between these two sides, and I can see it being very, very close once again. To be honest, I was tempted to go for a draw, but with this being Everton's first game in the new stadium, I do think they are going to come out on top, and I'm only just narrowly going to go for a 2-1 victory to Everton. Then it's time for the main event. The 4:30 kickoff for the second week in a row features Manchester United. So for anyone doubting how big Manchester United are, check that they've been the main event slot the first 2 weeks of the season. And now for United, they are travelling to Fulham, who, of course, were able to get that 96th-minute equaliser from Rodrigo Muniz to get themselves a point last week, meaning they are in 9th place. For Manchester United, it's that old familiar place of 15th following their defeat to Arsenal last week, which obviously I did my whole reaction to last time. I'm happy with the performance, wasn't happy with the result. But the question is, can these new Manchester United players now back up what was a good performance against Arsenal with a victory away at Fulham? History is certainly on their side when it comes to that potentially happening. Because if you didn't know, Manchester United have won the last 8 games in a row at Craven Cottage. It's one of the best away runs in the Premier League. United have won the last 8. So they do go into this as the early favourites, in my opinion. In terms of the team news, we would have, of course, expect Benjamin Sesko to make his first start. There's questions about who's going to play right wing back. Will it be Dalot or will it be Amad Diallo? Personally, I think it'll end up being Amad, but we'll see. Could we see a change in midfield? Will Ugarte come in? Will Mainu come in? For Fulham, I wouldn't expect many changes to their lineup. They don't really have any need to. There is question marks over Muniz once again. I mean, what a stand-up individual, being linked with a move away and still coming on and scoring a late equaliser for Fulham. If only there were other players in the Premier League who are as committed to clubs who are, you know, in the sort of talks of potentially selling their players. Really good for Muniz to see him come on and get that goal. As I said, I think it's going to be a really close one. The most common scoreline between these two sides over the last few years has been a 2-1 win to Manchester United. So yet again, I'm not going to put the biased hat on literally this time, but I am still going to put it on metaphorically, and I am going to go for another 2-1 win to Manchester United. I think it'd be a real surprise if they didn't back up their performance last week with a win here. But Fulham are a good side on their day, can produce the result. We shall see. And then finally, we have a game that really doesn't matter whatsoever. It's the Monday Night Football. It's Newcastle against Liverpool. And does anyone really care about this match? Not really. I'm, of course, joking. This is probably the biggest game of the weekend, with everything surrounding these two clubs at the moment, with all the Isak drama, with the tug of war for Ekatike a few weeks ago, with him ending up going to Liverpool, with Isak on strike, wanting to force a move to Liverpool. Will Liverpool cough up the money to pay for Isak? Will anything be done during or after this match? Will Isak get involved in regards to will he be at the stadium? Will they keep him away from the stadium to keep him away from Liverpool? Who knows? To be honest, I hate when stuff like this happens because it actually distracts away from what is a really, really big match and has been a really entertaining match over the last few seasons. So hopefully we can just keep things on the pitch in this one, but unfortunately I don't think that's the way it is going to go. For Newcastle, it was a pretty impressive performance, I think, against Aston Villa last week. Not quite enough to get the victory, although I think we all expected Anthony Gordon to get the goal if Konsa didn't bring him down. For Liverpool, pretty much a near mirror image of their Community Shield performance against Bournemouth last week. 2-0 up, pegged back to 2-2 after dropping off massively in the second half. However, unlike in the Community Shield, substitutes came on, made an impact. Chiesa late winner. Salah rounded it off, and it was a 4-2 victory for the defending champions. Since then, though, it's not gone great for them because Jeremy Frimpong has picked up an injury. And when you combine that with the injury to Connor Bradley, they do not have an out-and-out right-back available for this match. So Joe Gomez, who is permanently a fitness concern for them, is likely to start at right-back. If not, then it's probably going to be Wataru Endo, who seriously struggled out there against Bournemouth last week. For Newcastle, obviously there'll still be no Isak, but for them, I think we could see potentially a couple of new signings come into the team. Chiao potentially coming into centre-back. Jacob Ramsey could potentially play in any of the forward positions, but I think he's more likely to come off the bench. In terms of the head-to-head record, it was a 3-3 draw here last season with a 2-0 victory for Liverpool at Anfield. But let's not forget that 2-1 victory for Newcastle in the cup final. Of course, though, that was pioneered by a very good performance from Alexander Isak. He is unavoidable and inevitable when it comes to this fixture this weekend. Personally, I obviously think Liverpool are the favourites for it, but I do think Newcastle have a very good chance. They defended well last week. They still created chances last week, even without a recognised striker. And naturally, they're going to be so up for this. They'll be desperate to prove to Isak that Newcastle is the place to be, and there is no better way of doing that than beating the side that are trying to sign you. Personally, though, I don't think they're going to have enough to actually get a victory over Liverpool, but I'm going to go for the soap opera result, and I'm going to go for a 2-2 draw. I do think Liverpool are going to win this match, but I say it all the time on this series, I like to go for what I think could happen, not necessarily what I think will happen. The previews are there for you to make your own decisions, and then I make mine based off of what I do think could happen overall. But that is going to be it for today's video in terms of my predictions. Before we go, though, let's have a look at what you guys have been saying over the course of this week as to how you think these fixtures are going to go. The ones that jump out to me straight away, 100% of people that voted this week think Chelsea are going to beat West Ham tonight. That is a crazy, crazy stat in my opinion. Also, nobody thinks that Brentford are going to beat Aston Villa, which I also think is crazy. 71% going for Sunderland over Burnley, I think is fair enough after the week that they've had. And again, 70% think Liverpool are going to beat Newcastle. For me, I'm surprised it's that high. I do think Liverpool are favourites, but I am surprised it's that high. And 54% think that Brighton are going to go to Everton and beat them on their opening game in their new stadium. But as always, a massive thank you very much for watching. Let me know all of your thoughts on these games down in the comment section below. I'll pop my predictions back up for you before we leave. So as always, another massive thank you very much for watching. We'll do this all over again next week. Don't forget to check out my La Liga predictions, still available at the top of your screen right now. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you very soon.